Thank you for being here. I want to begin by saying I completely agree in the condemnation of the activity of Hamas and what's taking place to Jewish students on American college campuses. And we all should be speaking out against that publicly over and over. I was asked to make some comments on what the environment was at the time, and both in the House and the Senate, and also to talk a little bit about what and I'm speaking for myself, not for USCIRF, what I believe you might want to do and we should do to make a difference. Pew survey says that 80% of the world's population lives in a religiously repressive nation. An environment, we see it taking place in China, the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church, genocide, cultural genocide against the Tibetan Buddhists. I've been in Tibet, seen what every monastery has a public security police there. Can you imagine in your own church or your own synagogue to have the secret police there when you're going in to worship? Actual genocide against the Uyghur Muslims. The Falun Gong, we've seen 60,000 a year harvesting of their organs, and it's just so brutal. We see what's taking place. So it's going on all over the world. When the legislation was introduced, there was a lot of opposition to it. You would have thought that it would have been welcome. People would have said, this is a great idea. There was a lot of opposition. There was opposition by the Clinton administration. I'm going to read you something that Secretary Madeleine Albright, a speech that she gave at Catholic University. Let the record show, I love Madeleine Albright. Madeleine Albright lived in my congressional district. She had a farm up in Loudoun County. So this is not meant as a criticism of Madeleine Albright. But the administration at that time was opposed in the State Department. And she said at a speech, which interesting, it was October 23rd, today, 1997. And here's what Secretary Albright said at a speech at Catholic University. She said, it would establish a new and unneeded bureaucracy and deprive U.S. officials of the flexibility required to protect the overall foreign policy interests of the United States. They were opposed to it. The State Department was opposed to it. I am very grateful, and I will say it publicly, I'm grateful that President Clinton signed it in spite of the opposition by some in the administration. Secondly, the business community opposed it. I mean, the Chamber of Commerce and some of the high-tech companies, they opposed this thing. They didn't want to say publicly too much. They worked this hill over and over and through good offices. Let me just say, this has always been, particularly in the House, but also in the Senate, a bipartisan issue whereby Republicans and Democrats came together to kind of do something about it. The circumstances, I think, that kind of led to this was one, I believe President Reagan said that the words in the Constitution and the words in the Declaration of Independence were a covenant, not a contract, but a covenant with the people, not only of Philadelphia in 1776 and 1787, but with the entire world. President Reagan and Pope John Paul and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher kind of set the stage, if you will, when we saw the fall of the Soviet Union. Sudan was a big issue in the early 90s. And again, bipartisan, Republican and Democrats. Many times I would go to Sudan. There was almost always a Democratic member there. There was a Democratic and Republican head of the Sudan caucus. It was, so Sudan, remember, 1 million Christians mainly, some Muslims were killed by Bashir. You remember Bashir invited Osama bin Laden to live. Osama bin Laden lived in Sudan. And so that kind of led the effort, and there were a lot of people, and God bless your colleague, Senator John Danforth, when President Bush appointed Danforth to be the special envoy for Sudan, it made a tremendous difference. But Sudan got everybody interested following the fall of the Berlin Wall. Next, China. When you would go to China, I remember Chris Smith and I would go and talk to the underground Catholic bishops, and they would tell us a story, and we watched what took place in Tiananmen, and we talked at Tiananmen Square, people, family members, and everything. So China just kind of woke up the world to say what was taking place in China. Thirdly, and I think this is very important, I don't see it today. I don't mean that as criticism, but I don't see it today. The faith community was really involved. I wrote down the names last night. Chuck Colson. Chuck was just, God bless him, he was on this thing. Michael Horowitz, and I thank Senator Lieberman for him. Michael Horowitz really worked this issue. He was with the Heritage Foundation, or then Hudson Foundation during the time. Nina Shea, many of you know Nina. Nina wrote about this, was pushed by this. It was Cardinal Worrell. I remember I had a meeting in my office about a religious freedom issue, and I invited some people. Cardinal Worrell walked into my office. He was so interested in this issue. Then there were many, many others. Congressman Chris Smith, God bless. I think Chris Smith should be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Chris Smith has done more and been more and said more on this issue, but Chris was so dogged with regard to staying with this. And Harry Wu and the church community. There was a little group down in Texas called the Midland Ministerial Group, and a little town in Texas, Midland. They would come into town and they would work. So the faith community, and lastly, I want to give credit to the Jewish community. I was educated by many in my congressional district who were Jewish, who would come and tell me, and I really modeled them, and this would listen to Natan Sharansky, and Chris Smith and I went into Perm Camp 35. The Jewish community really led the effort on this. If you recall, there was a large rally on the mall. Ronald Reagan spoke. There were thousands there. I wish we could get that kind of a rally. So the Jewish community really did an outstanding. And I was also a bunch of men. I don't know if he's here. Rabbi Saperstein. Rabbi Saperstein, who I believe was the first or second president, head of USCIRF, was a dogged and really involved and helped educate me on this history. It was stalled. We passed it in the House. Now, this gentleman over here was the key. There were four key people. God bless him, Senator Arlen Specter. Arlen put the bill in. He was really good. He was from my home state of Pennsylvania, where I was born and raised, and Arlen Specter, very, very, very important. Senator Lieberman, very, very important. Senator Nichols, very, very important. In fact, there's the two people that literally saved the bill. They saved the bill. Not many people realize, but it was the last day. The people that saved the bill, Don Nichols, and the guy who I was in a small fellowship with him, and you know him well, Dan Coates. God bless Dan Coates. Dan couldn't be here, but if you know Dan Coates, tell him at Wolfstead, Coates is the best. Coates called about 6 o'clock at night. The House had still in session. Members told to go home, no more roll calls, just pro forma business. And Coates said, Nichols, I got this. We can get this over there. It's a little weakened now. It's watered down. Do you want it? Yes. He sent it over because of Don Nichols and Dan Coates. There was a law passed that set up this commission that's done all this. And if they had not done it, it would have never passed the next session because the opposition from the business community was rolling. So I said to Don Nichols, God bless Don Nichols, who lived in my congressional district when he must have read my mail sometimes, my newsletter, and Dan Coates. And I would ask you, when you see Dan, would you tell him, if it hadn't been for the two of you, it would have never passed. Where do we go from here? These are my own views. One, I think you have to keep it bipartisan. I think the giants of Henry Hyde and Tom Lantos, you got to keep it bipartisan. What made the success for Sudan was bipartisan. There were Republican and Democrat. You got to keep this thing bipartisan. Secondly, the faith community has to get back involved. Members of Congress, I have always said that everything that takes place in government and politics is downstream from culture. But everything that takes place in culture is downstream from the church, from the synagogue, from the mosque, from the community. We need the religious community to engage again and get back in this district the way that they were before. It would not have passed with regard to the leaders of Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim. All the groups came together then. They have to come together then. Nextly, we need to motivate the young people. When I see the young people on college campuses, this has to be an issue this is that they really deeply care. They're good on that campus. If we could educate them, I think the young people have to be involved. Next, this is going to be the next is going to be very, very controversial. It's my position, nobody else's. I think we have to ban lobbying for China. I don't believe we can have people lobbying, law firms in town lobbying for China when they're committing genocide against Uyghur Muslims and taking organs out from the Falun Gong and taking down crosses from Catholic churches and arresting Protestant house church leaders and doing that. So I think one recommendation that Congress should take is ban lobbying for China and then ban lobbying for any country that is a CPC designated country for 4 years straight. The reason is that would be the lobbyists would then help you because they could then go to the country and say, listen, you're going to be on a CPC. They're going to be banned. And so I think, but we have to ban lobby for China because of what they're doing. And also China is aiding Russia against Ukraine. And I support America's helping Ukraine, and yet China is aiding. And lastly, China is aiding Iran, which is behind, I believe, what's taking place today in Israel. Lastly, I think Congress has to give USCIRF the necessary funding. USCIRF's funding has been cut. It's now at $3.5 million, when if you looked at the rate of inflation, it would be very, very high. So Congress needs to give USCIRF at least $4.5 to $5 million funding. And lastly, you have to give a permanent authorization or a 3 to 5 year authorization to USCIRF so they don't have to desperately wonder, will they have a job or not have a job? But there needs to be a permanent or long-term funding with that necessary authorization. And with that, I just think that this is such an important issue that, again, I end where I began. Make it bipartisan. And one way to do that is ask a Republican and a Democratic member to come together and travel to a country where this is taking place, whereby they become friends and experience together so they can come back and work on this issue. Thank you very much.